The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when Snoop Dogg's sleek black SUV pulled up outside the Blue Room. It had been a long but productive day at the recording studio, where he'd been laying down tracks for his upcoming album. The familiar scent of jasmine and city air filled his lungs as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, his security team falling into their usual formation around him. The Blue Room wasn't his usual spot, but his sound engineer had recommended it, praising their signature cocktails and relaxed vibe. The neon blue sign above the door cast a cool glow on the street below, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Snoop could see the place was busy but not packed, perfect for a chill evening with his team. As he walked in, the buzz of conversations momentarily died down. You could feel the energy shift in the room, that familiar electricity that comes when someone everybody knows enters a space. Some folks tried to play it cool, pretending they hadn't noticed, while others nudged their friends and whispered excitedly. A group of young professionals at the bar couldn't help but stare, their phones discreetly emerging from pockets and purses. Snoop's longtime friend and producer was already there, having arrived a few minutes earlier to secure their usual setup, a comfortable corner booth away from the main crowd. The rapper moved through the space with that easy confidence that had become his trademark, nodding respectfully to people as he passed. He was dressed casually but sharp designer jeans, a crisp white button-down, and some exclusive sneakers that hadn't hit the market yet. The hostess, a young woman who managed to maintain her professional composure despite her obvious excitement, led them to their table. "Welcome to the Blue Room," she said warmly, handling the situation like a pro. "Would you like to start with some water for the table?" As they settled into the plush leather booth, the evening felt full of promise. The DJ was spinning some smooth R&B tracks at just the right volume, loud enough to vibe to but soft enough to talk over. The lighting was perfect, the mood was right, and the stress of the recording session was melting away. Snoop's security team positioned themselves discreetly nearby, blending in while staying alert. A waitress approached their table, her hands slightly shaking as she set down a round of water glasses. Snoop gave her one of his characteristic laid-back smiles, immediately putting her at ease. "No need to be nervous," he said kindly. "Just treat us like any other guests." His team nodded in agreement, and you could see her shoulders relax as she took their drink orders. The atmosphere in the Blue Room was exactly what they needed, sophisticated but unpretentious. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over the dark wood tables and leather seats. The bar itself was a masterpiece of marble and brass, behind which bottles glowed like jewels against backlit shelves. Looking around, Snoop could see people from all walks of life enjoying their evening. Young professionals unwinding after work, couples on dates, friends celebrating birthdays. It was the kind of diverse crowd he loved to see, everyone coexisting in that particular LA way. He watched as his team settled in, their conversations flowing easily as they discussed the day's recording session and plans for the upcoming weekend. Little did anyone know that this peaceful scene was about to change dramatically. For now, though, it was just another pleasant evening in LA, with good company and the promise of good drinks to come. Snoop leaned back in his seat, taking in the moment, completely unaware that in just a few minutes, this ordinary night out would turn into something that would make headlines across the country. The good vibes at the Blue Room lasted exactly 23 minutes. Snoop and his team had just received their first round of drinks when a tall man in a crisp suit came striding toward their table. Something about his walk, stiff and purposeful, made the security team sit up straighter. This was Richard Thompson, the bar manager, though nobody knew him yet. Thompson didn't bother with introductions. He stood at the edge of their table, arms crossed, looking down at the group with poorly disguised disdain. "Is there going to be a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby conversations stop mid-sentence. Snoop looked up from his drink, confusion crossing his face. The question seemed to come out of nowhere. They'd been quietly chatting, laughing softly, doing nothing to draw attention except existing in the space. One of his producers spoke up. Sorry, man, is something wrong? We have a certain standard here, Thompson replied, emphasizing each word like he was talking to children. A certain clientele we cater to. His eyes swept across the table, making his meaning crystal clear without saying the quiet part out loud. A couple at the next table exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman whispered something to her partner, both looking increasingly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Around the bar, phones started to appear, recording discreetly as people sensed something troubling unfolding. Snoop's security team shifted slightly, ready to move if needed, but Snoop himself remained remarkably calm. He'd seen this movie before, lived through this scene too many times. Brother, he said quietly, we're just here to enjoy some drinks after work. Same as everybody else. Thompson's face reddened. Well, maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. Somewhere more suitable for your type of crowd. The last few words hung in the air like smoke, toxic and unmistakable. By now, the entire bar had gone quiet. The DJ had even lowered the music, perhaps unconsciously responding to the tension in the room. A young bartender behind the counter looked mortified, frantically texting on her phone, presumably trying to reach someone higher up in management. Our type of crowd? One of Snoop's team members repeated, his voice controlled but tight with anger. You want to explain what you mean by that? Thompson straightened his tie, a nervous tick betraying his false confidence. I've had complaints, he claimed, though everyone within earshot knew this was a lie. Other customers are uncomfortable. A voice piped up from 3 tables over. No, we're not. It was an older white gentleman in a business suit, looking appalled at Thompson's behavior. The only one making people uncomfortable here is you, sir. The support from other customers seemed to throw Thompson off balance, but he doubled down. I have the right to refuse service to anyone, he declared, his voice getting louder, more defensive. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave. Snoop slowly set his drink down. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how one of hip-hop's biggest legends would handle such blatant discrimination. The moment stretched out like a rubber band ready to snap. Phones were recording openly now. Some customers had stood up, ready to intervene if needed. Others were already posting on social media, their fingers flying across screens as they documented what was quickly becoming a viral moment in the making. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thompson stood there, seemingly realizing he'd crossed a line, but too proud or too prejudiced to back down. Snoop's team waited, following their leader's lead, watching as he prepared to respond to this all-too-familiar scene in what would turn out to be an unforgettable way. Things at the Blue Room went from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. Thompson, the bar manager, was now fully caught up in his own power trip, his face getting redder by the second. What had started as thinly veiled racism was now spilling out into the open, like a pot boiling over. I won't tell you again, Thompson practically shouted, his composure completely gone. We don't want your kind making trouble here. The words echoed through the now silent bar, bouncing off the walls and hitting everyone like a physical blow. Several customers gasped audibly. A group of young professionals near the bar immediately closed their tabs, refusing to spend another dollar in the establishment. Snoop's security team had moved closer, not to threaten but to protect, forming a subtle barrier between their client and the increasingly aggressive manager. One of Snoop's producers pulled out his phone, hitting record. Say that again for the camera, he said calmly. Let everyone see exactly who you are. That's when Thompson really lost it. You think I care about your videos? I own this place. He didn't, of course. He was just a manager, but power had gone to his head. I've got connections all over this city. Nobody's going to care about what happens here tonight. An older couple who'd been regular customers for years stood up and walked out, the woman shaking her head in disgust. We've been coming here every Friday for 5 years, she announced loudly on her way out. Never again. The door hadn't even closed behind them when they started posting about the incident on social media. More phones were recording now, capturing every word, every gesture. Thompson seemed to notice this finally, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You think you can intimidate me with your phones? Go ahead, record all you want. I'm protecting my business from troublemakers." A young bartender, who'd been watching everything unfold in horror, finally spoke up. "Sir, they haven't done anything wrong. They're just sitting here quietly like everyone else." Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. Thompson spun around to face her, pointing his finger threateningly. "You're fired. Get your things and get out." This caused another stir in the crowd. 2 more tables got up to leave in protest. Someone in the back shouted, "The only troublemaker here is you, man." Others nodded in agreement, some even starting to approach the scene, ready to stand with Snoop and his team. The DJ, who had been watching everything unfold, deliberately put on one of Snoop's classics at a low volume. It was a subtle but clear sign of solidarity that brought small smiles to several faces in the crowd. Thompson whirled around again, now completely losing control. "Turn that off immediately." Through all of this, Snoop remained seated, watching everything with an almost anthropological interest. His calm seemed to infuriate Thompson even more. "What? Nothing to say?" Thompson taunted. "Not so tough without your music and your fans, are you?" The irony, of course, was that Snoop had stayed completely peaceful throughout the entire interaction. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any threats, hadn't done anything but exist in a space Thompson deemed off-limits to people who looked like him. By now, the videos were already spreading across social media like wildfire. #BlueDroomRacist was trending locally, and the bar's social media pages were being flooded with comments. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather as word spread about what was happening inside. Thompson, realizing he was losing control of the situation, but too proud to back down, made his final mistake. He reached for Snoop's drink, presumably to take it away, but Snoop's security smoothly stepped between them. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Nobody expected what came next, least of all Thompson himself. The whole room froze as Snoop Dogg finally stood up. He took his time, straightening his designer shirt, adjusting his chain. The silence was so complete you could hear ice shifting in glasses across the room. Everyone expected anger, confrontation, drama. After all, that's how these situations usually played out. But Snoop had something else in mind. He looked straight at Thompson, who seemed to shrink slightly under his gaze. When Snoop spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. "You know what's funny?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, but soft enough that people had to lean in. "I've been all over the world. Met presidents, kings, people from every walk of life. And still, sometimes, I walk into a place and see that nothing's changed." Thompson blinked, clearly thrown off by this unexpected response. He'd been ready for anger, prepared for a fight. This quiet dignity was something he didn't know how to handle. "Let me tell you a story," Snoop continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a natural storyteller. "Back in the day, my grandma used to tell me about places she couldn't go, water fountains she couldn't drink from. She'd tell me these stories not to make me angry, but to make me understand something important." People had their phones up, recording every word. The young bartender who'd been fired was wiping tears from her eyes. Even the security team stood motionless, letting their boss handle this his way. "She told me that hate is like a poison," Snoop went on, his words filling the room. "But it poisons the person holding it more than anyone else. Look at you, brother." He gestured at Thompson's red face, his shaking hands, his obvious distress. "All that hate you're carrying. Who's it hurting more? Me, sitting here enjoying my evening? Or you, getting all worked up about nothing?" A few people in the crowd nodded. Someone whispered, "Amen." Thompson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could get angry right now, could call my lawyers, could make a big scene. But you know what? That's not teaching anybody anything. Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He placed enough money on the table to cover everyone's drinks, plus a generous tip for the staff. Instead, I'm going to thank you. This caused a stir in the room. Thompson looked completely confused. Thank me, he sputtered. Yeah, thank you, because you just gave everyone in this room a choice. They can choose to be like you, holding on to hate that makes no sense, or they can choose to be better. Snoop gestured around the room at all the people who had stood up against the discrimination. Looks like most of them already made their choice. With that, Snoop turned to his team. Let's roll, he said quietly. But before leaving, he turned back one last time. I've seen this before, brother. But hate ain't the way. Never was, never will be. I hope you learn from this, I really do. The impact of his words hung in the air like music. As Snoop and his team prepared to leave, other customers stood up, some applauding, others just nodding in respect. Thompson stood there, seemingly frozen, watching as his actions and Snoop's response painted two very different pictures of humanity. Outside, the evening air felt fresher somehow. A small crowd had gathered, word having spread through social media. They weren't angry or rowdy. They just wanted to show support. Snoop acknowledged them with a wave as he headed to his car, leaving behind a scene that would be talked about for months to come, not for its conflict, but for its lesson in grace under pressure. The internet moves fast, but that night, it moved at lightning speed. Within an hour of Snoop Dogg leaving the Blue Room, videos of the incident were everywhere. People who'd been there shared their recordings from different angles, each clip adding another piece to the story. The hashtag Snoop Standsup shot to the top of trending lists, not just in LA, but worldwide. One video, shot by a customer near the bar, captured Snoop's entire speech perfectly. The way he stood there, calm and collected, turning a moment of hate into a lesson about dignity. It hit different. People weren't just sharing it, they were feeling it. Comments poured in by the thousands. This is how you handle hate. Pure class. My grandma told me the same stories. Snoop speaking truth. That manager thought he had power. Snoop showed him what real power looks like. The young bartender who got fired posted her own video, tears still in her eyes, but speaking with conviction. I couldn't stay quiet, she explained. Some things are more important than a job. Her video went viral too, with job offers flooding her DMs from restaurants and bars across the city. Celebrity reactions started rolling in. Basketball stars, actors, musicians. Everyone had something to say. But they weren't just talking about the incident. They were sharing their own stories, times they'd faced similar treatment. The conversation grew bigger than one night at one bar. A group of teens in Minnesota made a remix of Snoop's speech, laying his words over a gentle beat. It hit different streaming platforms by midnight, people calling it the protest song that doesn't sound like a protest song. The beat carried Snoop's message about his grandmother's stories, about choosing love over hate, about being better. Local news crews showed up at the Blue Room, but the place was already closed. Someone had taped signs to the windows. Hate has no home here, and do better. People driving by honked in support. A few stopped to take pictures, shaking their heads at how a regular night out had turned into something so much bigger. The Blue Room's parent company was caught in a storm they never saw coming. Their social media team tried to keep up with the flood of messages, but it was impossible. Every post they'd ever made was filled with comments asking them to take action. Their Yelp page crashed from the volume of new reviews. But something unexpected was happening too. Between all the anger and calls for boycotts, people were having real conversations. Folks were sharing stories about times they stayed quiet when they should have spoken up, about moments they wished they'd handled differently. Snoop's response had people talking about how to face hate with dignity, how to stand up without throwing down. A middle-aged business owner in Texas posted, "Been running my restaurant 30 years. Just called a staff meeting for tomorrow. We're gonna watch this video together and talk about it. This is how change happens." The overnight shift at the Blue Room was eerily quiet. The security guard posted a video of the empty bar, usually packed on a night like this. In the background, you could still see the table where everything went down. His caption read, "Sometimes the loudest message is an empty room." By sunrise, the story had made international news. News anchors were playing the clips, social commentators were breaking down the significance, but the most powerful responses were still coming from regular people. A grandmother in Georgia posted a photo of her own segregation-era memories, thanking Snoop for understanding that the story wasn't just about one night in one bar. The internet can be a rough place, quick to judge and slow to forgive. But sometimes, when the right moment meets the right response, it becomes something else. A mirror showing us who we are and who we want to be. That night, Snoop Dogg didn't just handle a bad situation well, he gave people a blueprint for handling their own moments of truth. The morning after the incident at the Blue Room, Los Angeles woke up different. The city had seen its share of celebrity drama, but this wasn't about celebrity. This was about something deeper. By 9 a.m., a crowd had gathered outside the bar, not to protest or cause trouble, but to make a point about community. Local business owners from the neighborhood showed up first. The coffee shop owner across the street brought hot drinks for everyone. The bookstore owner 2 blocks down handed out Unity in Business pins she'd stayed up all night making. They weren't there to shut anything down. They were there to lift something up. A community leader who'd been fighting discrimination in LA nightlife for years arrived with a stack of papers. "This isn't just about one night," she explained to the news crews that had gathered. "This is about every person who's ever been turned away for looking wrong or being too different. We've been collecting these stories for years. Now people are finally ready to listen." The crowd grew steadily throughout the morning. Food truck owners parked nearby, giving out free meals to anyone who came to show support. An older gentleman set up a small PA system and invited people to share their stories. One by one, folks stepped up, not just to talk about discrimination, but to share moments when strangers stood up for them, just like the customers had stood up for Snoop. Around noon, something unexpected happened. The Blue Room staff, not the management, but the bartenders, servers, and kitchen workers, showed up together. The young bartender who'd been fired led the group. They weren't there to ask for their jobs back. Instead, they announced plans to open their own place, one where everyone would be welcome. "Last night taught us something," she told the growing crowd. "It showed us that one person's hate doesn't have to poison everything." We saw customers stand up, speak out, walk out. That's the kind of energy we want to build on. The local business association called an emergency meeting. The topic wasn't just the Blue Room. It was about creating clear guidelines for all neighborhood businesses. "We need to do better," the association president said. "Not because we got caught, but because it's right." By mid-afternoon, civil rights organizations had set up information booths nearby. They weren't just handing out flyers. They were collecting stories, offering legal advice, and most importantly, showing people how to turn a moment into a movement. A lawyer who specialized in discrimination cases offered free consultations right there on the sidewalk. The crowd kept growing, but it stayed peaceful. People brought chairs, set up small tables, turned the sidewalk into a kind of community forum. Kids drew pictures in chalk, hands holding hands, hearts, messages of love. An ice cream truck showed up and gave out free cones to the kids. The owner said it was his way of showing what business should really be about, bringing joy, not spreading hate. As the sun started to set, someone brought out guitars. Others joined in with percussion instruments. The music wasn't angry or confrontational. It was hopeful, bringing together different styles, just like the crowd brought together different people. The food trucks were still there, now joined by local restaurants bringing out trays of food to share. The media called it a protest, but it felt more like a block party with a purpose. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans, started organizing committees to address discrimination in their neighborhood. A local tech company offered to create a free app where people could report and track discriminatory incidents at businesses. What had started as an ugly moment of bias was transforming into something beautiful. A community coming together not just to oppose something bad, but to create something good. As night fell, the crowd lit up their phone flashlights, creating a sea of light. Someone started singing "Stand By Me," and soon hundreds of voices joined in. The day showed that real change doesn't always come from big gestures or loud voices. Sometimes it comes from people simply showing up, standing together, and refusing to let hate have the last word. 2 weeks after the incident at the Blue Room, Thompson sat alone in his small apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers. His life had fallen apart like a house of cards. Not only had he lost his job, but his face was everywhere. The manager who tried to kick out Snoop Dogg for no good reason. His phone kept buzzing with messages from old friends, most of them asking one question: "What were you thinking?" That morning, he watched the video for the 100th time. But this time was different. Instead of feeling defensive, he really listened to Snoop's words about his grandmother, about poison, about choice. Something finally clicked. With shaking hands, he picked up his phone and called his cousin, who had connections in the music industry. "I need to make this right," he said, his voice cracking. "Not for my career, not for the cameras. I need to do this for me." It took 3 days of back and forth messages before Snoop's team agreed to a meeting. They chose a small community center, neutral ground. Thompson arrived early, his heart pounding. He rehearsed what he wanted to say 1,000 times, but when Snoop walked in, every practiced word flew out of his head. Snoop didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, calm and collected, waiting. The silence stretched out until Thompson couldn't take it anymore. "I've been trying to understand," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "Trying to figure out why I did what I did. And the truth is, I was raised with certain ideas, certain ways of thinking. I never questioned them." The rap legend nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. Thompson pulled out some old family photos he'd brought. "This is my grandfather's store," he said, pointing to a black and white image. He had signs up, signs that make me sick to look at now. But I grew up hearing him talk about how things were supposed to be. I never realized I was carrying his hate inside me until it came spilling out that night. Snoop leaned forward, really looking at the photos. "Your grandfather's story ain't that different from my grandmother's," he said quietly. They both lived in a world that told them who they could be, where they could go. The difference is what we chose to do with those stories. The conversation lasted hours. They talked about family, about history, about change. Thompson shared memories he'd never told anyone. Moments when he'd felt that twist of prejudice in his gut, but pushed it down. Snoop listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking questions that made Thompson think deeper. "You know what the hardest part is?" Thompson admitted near the end. "Looking in the mirror and seeing someone you don't want to be anymore. Someone you're ashamed of being." Snoop smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Nah, brother. The hardest part is already behind you. Admitting you need to change, that's the big step. Everything after that is just walking the path." Before they left, Thompson asked if he could share something he'd written, a public apology, but more than that, a promise to do better. Snoop read it carefully, then suggested they record it together. Not as a publicity stunt, but as a real moment between two people bridging a gap that had seemed uncrossable. As they wrapped up, Thompson asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why did you agree to meet me? After what I did, you had every right to shut me out." Snoop stood up, straightening his jacket. "Because change doesn't happen in isolation," he said. It happens when people who got it wrong get the chance to get it right. My grandma taught me that too. That evening, Thompson walked home through streets that felt different somehow. He had a lot of work to do, a lot of minds to change, starting with his own. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: hope. 1 month after the viral incident, the basement of a community center buzzed with activity. Tables were arranged in a circle, and people from all walks of life filled every seat. At the front of the room stood an unlikely pair, Snoop Dogg and Thompson, the former bar manager, ready to launch their unity in the community training program. "Welcome to day one," Thompson began, his voice steadier than he felt. "A month ago, I was the problem we're here to solve. Today, I'm part of the solution." He paused, looking around the room. "And believe me, if I can change, anyone can." The room was packed with restaurant owners, bar managers, servers, and security staff from across Los Angeles. Some came willingly, eager to learn. Others were sent by worried business owners who didn't want to be the next viral video. But as the session progressed, something remarkable happened. Defenses started dropping. Snoop took the floor, but not with prepared speeches or fancy presentations. Instead, he shared real stories. He talked about the first time he realized he wasn't welcome somewhere because of how he looked. He described walking into high-end stores, even after becoming famous, and still being followed by security. "But here's the thing," he said, gesturing to Thompson. "My man here proved something powerful. When you know better, you do better. That's what this is about." They broke the group into smaller circles. People started sharing their own stories, not just about discrimination they'd faced, but times they'd made assumptions about others. A bouncer admitted he treated people differently based on how they dressed. A restaurant owner confessed she'd sometimes seated customers based on appearances. The young bartender who'd stood up to Thompson that night was there too, now helping lead discussions. She brought up subtle forms of discrimination, the little things that often go unnoticed but add up to make people feel unwelcome. They role-played different scenarios: how to handle difficult situations, how to recognize their own biases, how to speak up when they see something wrong. But it wasn't just about what not to do. It was about creating genuinely welcoming spaces. During the lunch break, food trucks parked outside provided meals from different cultures. People sat with strangers, sharing food and stories. The simple act of eating together broke down more barriers than any formal training could. As the afternoon session began, Snoop surprised everyone by bringing in some special guests. Regular people who'd experienced discrimination at restaurants and bars. They weren't there to shame anyone, but to help everyone understand the impact of being made to feel unwelcome. An older gentleman spoke about taking his grandchildren to a fancy restaurant for their graduation and being seated by the kitchen despite having reservations. A young woman described celebrating her promotion at a bar and being repeatedly asked if she could afford her drinks. Their stories hit home in a way statistics never could. Thompson then shared his own journey of the past month. He talked about digging deep into his family history, understanding where his biases came from, and actively working to change them. "It's not enough to just not be racist," he explained. "We have to be actively welcoming." The program wasn't just talk. They developed practical tools: checklists for businesses to evaluate their practices, guidelines for handling difficult situations, ways to train new staff. Everything was designed to be real-world useful, not just theoretically good. As the day wound down, people didn't rush to leave. They hung around, exchanging contact information, making plans to visit each other's businesses, building a network of support. What had started as mandatory training had turned into something more: a community committed to real change. Before everyone left, Snoop had one final message. "This ain't about one day of training. It's about changing how we see each other, how we treat each other, every single day. Y'all ain't just learning this stuff. You're gonna go teach it to others. That's how we make change stick." 1 year later, The blue room had transformed into something entirely different. The old sign was gone, replaced by a new one reading, "The Unity Room." The young bartender who'd stood up against discrimination that night was now the owner, having bought the place with help from community investors who believed in her vision. Inside, the changes were more than just cosmetic. The walls displayed local artwork celebrating diversity. The staff looked like a mini United Nations, and the music playlist jumped smoothly from hip-hop to country to salsa. But the biggest change was in the atmosphere. You could feel it the moment you walked in. On this particular evening, Thompson stood at a podium in the corner of the packed room. He'd been invited to speak at the one-year anniversary of what people now called the night that changed LA. His hands weren't shaking anymore when he talked about his transformation. "A year ago, I was the face of everything wrong with this industry," he began, looking around at the diverse crowd. "Today, I travel to other cities, sharing what I learned. But more importantly, I listen. Every day, I listen and learn something new." The place was packed with familiar faces. The regulars who'd stood up that night were there. So were graduates from every session of the Unity in the community program. Even some of the social media influencers who'd helped spread the original story showed up to see what had changed. At the bar, a wall of photos told the story of the past year. There was Snoop and Thompson at the first training session. The community gathering that turned into a block party. The day the young bartender got her business loan. Each picture showed another step in a journey that had started with confrontation but led to conversation. The Unity Room had become more than just a bar. During the day, it hosted community meetings. Local groups used the space for cultural celebrations. Job fairs were held there. It had become what people started calling a yes space, a place where everyone could feel like they belonged. Thompson's speech was interrupted by a surprise video message from Snoop, projected on the wall. 1 year ago, the rapper said, "I walked into a place that showed us how far we still had to go. Tonight, y'all are sitting in a place that shows us how far we can come when we choose to be better." The video continued with clips from Unity in the community sessions across the country. The program had spread to 30 cities, each one adapting it to address their own local challenges. Business owners shared stories of how their places had changed. Customers talked about feeling welcome in spots they'd once avoided. Back in the room, people were nodding, some wiping away tears. The older gentleman who'd spoken up that first night was there with his grandkids, proudly showing them the spot where he'd taken a stand. The food trucks that had fed protesters were now permanent fixtures outside, their owners having formed a successful coalition. As Thompson wrapped up his speech, he shared something he'd never told anyone. "That night, when Snoop told me hate was a poison, I didn't get it. But now I understand. Letting go of hate didn't make me weaker. It made me stronger. It made room for something better." The evening ended with an impromptu jam session. Someone brought out a guitar, another person sat at the piano, and soon the room was filled with music. Nobody cared who wrote the songs or where they came from. They just played together, creating something new and beautiful. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy. But inside the Unity Room, people had found something special. Proof that one moment of darkness could lead to years of light, if you were brave enough to flip the switch. As the last customers left that night, the young owner stood in the doorway, watching them go. Each person who walked out carried a piece of the story with them. A story about how change happens, not in big, dramatic moments, but in the small choices we make every day to be better than we were before.